Hi. Thank you very much for having me. And I would also just like to thank the organisers, in particular Gloria Cabedi and her team. They've made me most welcome. I'm going to talk to you for about half an hour and then hopefully have some questions and comments. So sorry, first of all, if any of you thought that a discussion about networking and networks was going to be of the how-to kind. You all know how to network. The question is whether you know how important, how fundamentally important networks and networking is in what is clearly the age of connection. I think it's no exaggeration to say that at no time in human history have we been undergoing such fundamental changes in the technology we use and our ability to do what we've always done, which is to connect and to communicate. However, what I'm really going to talk to you about could be described as connection and its discontents. Much of the time, we're hyper-connected. Some of the time, we're disconnected. We're certainly overloaded. So what I want to talk to you about, and in my work, I think and write and teach and consult and do networking, is how do we make sense of this very complicated age, the challenges of it, in order to survive it and in order to continue to learn and to share. Although I take the point at the beginning that whilst we are in a sharing world, please remember, don't ever overshare. And I say that as somebody whose children regularly take over each other's Instagram accounts. It can be terribly, terribly frightening. The first thing I want to say is that what is really interesting to me is that when we think about networks, we must understand, as the physicist Albert Laszlo Barabasi put it, networks are everywhere. Now that may seem like a completely duh point, but I want you to understand that when you use networks, when you are organizing who you connect to and reach across to, you are doing something that is fundamental to the entire universe. The structures are remarkably similar in the natural world and the human world. In fact, the only difference between us and the technology that we deploy is that whichever artificial intelligence we use, it will only be mimicking the most successful transmitter of all time. And what is the most successful transmitter of all time? The human being. However, human beings behave in remarkably similar ways to the natural world and technology. And one of the things we do is we proliferate our networks and we spread. You can't really be a network of one. You have to be a network of many. And that brings with it certain challenges, certain difficulties, as I hope we will see. So the challenge is how to embrace the connected age, how to embrace proliferation, not to be overwhelmed by it, and to recognize when it is good, everything is of course subjective, and when it's bad. So we are in the middle, as I said, of a very important seismic age. We're in the middle of what the Pew Center and Toronto University academics Barry Wellman and Lee Rainey call the triple revolution. That is of the internet, social networks, and the mobile. And we mustn't underestimate how quickly that has happened. Martin said my career spans from telex to Twitter. I'm not that old, even though my daughter memorably said to me, "Mum, in your day," pause, terrible moment to be a mother and to be asked, "in your day, were there cars or just horses?" But you take my point, things have moved very, very fast. When we talk about networks, it's very important to understand they're not just found in trees, they are found in technology. All of electrical, electronic, fiber optic cables are just networks. Networks are just a series of connecting points, and it's the behaviors of these connecting points which interest me, and it's your behaviors as connectors of a different kind, which interests me. Now, I've been told that there's a little lasery thing. Apparently, they have to make this incredibly big because otherwise people accidentally walk off with it. So now, there are probably three main architects of social network science that I would refer to again and again and again. And one of them is the American sociologist Ronald Burt. Ronald Burt's theory on brokerage and closure is very, very seminal when you want to understand the way humans network. And basically, I'm not going to dwell very long on this, and I'm probably going to be standing corrected by some of you in the audience. But the fundamental thing is the betweenness and the closeness and the ability to have open or closed networks. That, to me, is really important because part of the problem of networks, bad networks, is that they are way, way too closed, as we'll see. But forget talking about networks as trees, networks as computers. Networks are fundamentally human. And here are two humans I want to tell you about very quickly. They are two 21-year-olds. Louise lives in Equatorial Guinea, and KSI Olajidet, KSI for short, lives in London. And I'm going to tell you their stories as networkers. Louise's story is not a happy one, although she's still alive. This is the Ebola virus. In 2014, Louise caught Ebola from the village that was regarded as the ground zero of the latest Ebola outbreak. Some children in Gwekadu village province in Guinea smoked some bats out of a tree, brought them back to their village, lit a fire and ate them. And almost immediately people started to die. The spread of information, the human network was very, very confused. And the story of Ebola in this particular outbreak is not just one of the behavior of the virus on the human network. It's the behavior of the human network in response to that virus. And many of those mistakes will be mistakes that go down into the books that you might find useful in the coming years about how you organize communication, not just in a crisis, but how you understand the way information, misinformation, and indeed disease spreads. So what happened to Louise is she got sick, but she was frightened because the rumor mill was saying that it was witchcraft by white men. And so she ran away. And she ran away over the border into Sierra Leone, and there was no border control. She took a motor taxi and she just walked across the border into Sierra Leone, which has 6 million people in it. And she brought the virus into Sierra Leone, even though it turned out that she was on a list of people in Guinea affected. So this is how you can look at network behavior as answering some very fundamental questions, which is how does disease spread along a human network? And in Louise's case, and I am no mathematician, it was across something that's called a scale-free network, which is both the best and worst kind of network. If you want to sell 100 million trillion units of something, you want it to scale free. If you want to spread a computer virus, you want it to scale free. But if you want to stop a disease spreading across into a pandemic, you do not want it to become a scale-free network, which is that it begins to proliferate endlessly. So whether you're in the business of stopping and controlling disease or behaviors, understanding the different properties of networks becomes quite valuable and, to me, interesting. This is a different kind of network, and this is KSI's network. This is the 21-year-old Londoner who, in about the same amount of time relative to the spread of Ebola in Sierra Leone, garnered 10 million viewers to his YouTube channel, which he celebrated at about the same time Louise Camano was walking across the border from Guinea into Sierra Leone. So this is a different kind of phenomenon, but it operates on the same properties. It operates actually on the scale-free network. So what I'd like to suggest is that it is important when you look at the modern world to understand that everything you are doing and on and in is a form of network. And we're very familiar, aren't we, with social networks. Hands up here who is on a social network, LinkedIn, Twitter, Pinterest. Put your hands up if you are on a social network. Thank you. Put your hands down. Please put your hand up if you are not. Okay, so we are all connected. We're all sharing, and hopefully not like Tim Hunt of UCL oversharing, because that caused a disaster. Twitter is an example of the way, in an ordinary, undramatic way, we are all hyper-connecting. Our organizations are using social platforms and so on. The World Economic Forum estimates that by 2020, there will be 50 billion connected devices. 50 billion. Only last week, Facebook celebrated 1/7 of the world's population being on it on the same day. So something very extraordinary is happening around scale and indeed around speed. And what I want to suggest to you is that as human networks, as networkers, you need to come to some decisions about how you use scale and speed, because you are in fact just human. You are not machines. And that to me is the biggest tension we all face in this hyper-connected age, is how to, put it another way, keep it real. However, we are in fact all just like computers. We all connect to nodes and hubs, and we're routers, and some of us are more centralized connectors. The writer Nick Hornby, who many of you in Britain will know, came up to me once about 25 years ago, and he said, "Do you know, Julia, you're a maven?" I said, "Well, is that a good thing? I'm not sure you're not insulting me." And he said, "Oh yes, I've just read the Malcolm Gladwell book about mavens and connectors." And indeed, it turns out that I am. Some people who are regarded as natural networkers might be described as extrovert, might be described actually as introvert. But the ability to connect many people as a hub is what defines all of networks. And in fact, Louise Camano was not the hub spreader of her Ebola. What happened was she went back into her village and she gave it to her aunt. And her aunt was a hub. Her aunt was the hub. So someone amongst you is a super spreader, right? Someone amongst you is a fantastic social super spreader, or, you know, I know what conferences are like, you know, don't have unprotected sex. You know, you might be spreaders of all sorts of things, okay? Human beings, like any other network, have different properties. Some of you are routers from one avenue to another. The human being's ability to spread not just disease, but ideas, but culture, but language, is what makes us the leader of the species pack. That's what's fascinating about us, but that's what gives us these incredible challenges. So I want to talk a bit about good and bad networks. It is, of course, subjective. But I want to think, when you leave the case conference and you begin to organize yourselves, are you doing it in a good way or a bad way? Might be a better way of describing it. So I'm going to give you 3 examples. The first is one very familiar to academics. It's collaboration. This is, in fact, the Hadron Collider. It's a rather beautiful image, and it looks a bit like a network, doesn't it? The Hadron Collider could not have, the Higgs boson, the Higgs boson and the Hadron Collider couldn't have happened without scientific collaboration, without networks. So that is good. Collaboration is good. Connecting with others and building something together is a form of a good network. Not all of you come from Britain, but 80% of you in this room, I think, are from the UK. This is a British example. These three figures all were connected to a leading charity that was the sort of it girl of charities called Kids Company. The figure, the multicolored figure is a very remarkable woman called Camilla Batmangela, who founded the charity to help street kids and to organize in a way that mimicked the family network. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, and the creative director of the BBC, who for the last 18 years has been the chair of trustees of this charity. This charity imploded about 6 weeks ago, completely imploded. It turned out it had no financial reserves. It turned out that Camilla, for all her remarkable qualities, has no qualifications in the very thing that underpinned the charity's work, which is child psychology. They made a big show of children self-referring, and it turns out that's because nobody else was authorized to refer these children. And yet, this charity was fabulously successful and productive. It built a powerful network, did it not, those of you in the UK who followed it? Any celebrity, any politician, any media worth their salt supported this network. But it had a flaw. It was reinforcing its own beliefs. It was following groupthink. Anyone who's run a business, anyone who's involved in a charity knows you have to have good governance, good financial management. You need to say, that's not quite right, even if the cause is brilliant. And you know what? Nobody did. That is a bad network to me. Even if the work is good, even if the cause is good, you can't function by doing things improperly. And you have to be able to ask the question at any given time of your network, are they giving me the truth? Because if you're not, you're going to run into difficulties down the line. And the collapse of Kids Company is a very extraordinary example, and at the heart of it, I think, is a poorly structured network. But let's come up with another really bad network. Okay, so you have Osama bin Laden and you have the crash of 2008. I think we can all agree both were bad. Both of them were very broad. The whole point about Al-Qaeda is that it was structured in a very clever way, which is there was no real center of the network. ISIL is another example. And the crash of 2008, if one comes to the actual root of it, was conducted by, not just by global bankers and so on and so forth, but by a particular network, the subprime mortgage traders, okay? And what unites them in being bad networks is that they were totally myopic. They didn't have what Ronald Burt calls structured holes. The terminology in network science is just so great, by the way, structured holes. But what that means is you need oxygen and air to let ideas circulate. What would have happened if someone had gone, hey, Bob, I don't think it's such a good idea to sell very, very poor people collateralized debt like this. What happens if they can't pay it back? No one raised that voice. That's a problem. So the point about good networks is you've got to let the air circulate. It's not about reinforcing what you want it to be or how you want the narrative. That's a bad network practice. Weak ties. The second great figure in all of this theory is somebody called Mark Granovetter, also an American who in 1973 wrote a very seminal paper on weak ties, the strength of weak ties. And put simply, he said, and most of you will find this, that the way to get a good job is to have wide networks. I'd like to put it another way. Everybody is interesting and everybody is useful, and nobody in a hierarchy matters as much as people in a lateral life. There is no such thing as one person being more important or more useful than anybody else in this world. The difficulty is that most organizations are still very structured in the silo, very structured in the vertical, very structured in the hierarchy. But that isn't the way networks and ties work. And at the heart of good networks, at the heart of the human transmission of information and ideas and disease and good things and bad, is trust and intimacy. And that's what defines the connection, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So the diversity of your network matters. So if you are only reaching out to people you already know, who are going to reinforce what you know, but maybe help you in the short term, I'd like you to think again. I'd like you to think about people you don't know, or people and ideas that you need to bring in to your own department, idea space, because they are the ones that are going to help you build a healthy and a strong network. There's another network science thinker called Valdis Krebs, and in 2001, which was a very big moment in network science and sociological thinking, wrote a paper about the difference between the jazz ensemble and the orchestra. And put simply, he said, and I think this is really relevant, if you organize yourself in highly rigid structures, you are not going to be able to let in flexibility and fluidity. You need to be able to go with the riff and the unexpected and to collaborate. And the image of that is the difference between the jazz ensemble and the orchestra. Now that does it for me. Replace it with hip hop if that's easier. But you get my point. Organized systems are brilliant and you can't do without them, but you might need to overlay with something a bit different for now. We're talking about what this age, this hyper-connected age, requires. The final person who I think is brilliant on the application of network science is Herminia Ibarra from INSEAD, and she's just visiting LBS. And in her new book, she talks about networking out and across. So the theory is there, the social science is there, the maths is there. The difficulty is how do you behave in that way? And the key word, unsurprisingly, is the word social. We have social work, we have social capital. Social capital is the slightly contested, but it is a metric of sorts by which the skills and the knowledge of individuals and communities becomes valuable and can be measured. In fact, Harvard Business Press has just published a kind of influential paper on valuing the new skills, the social skills of the labor market. So the word social, the concept of social, is really important to understanding networks. But so is a different word, health. Nearly 70 years ago, the World Health Organization defined health as not merely the absence of infirmity and disease, but of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Now that is really, really interesting, isn't it? 70 years later, we're in the middle of the social revolution, and guess what? How many of us have the same strategies around our digital and our human interactions as we do around our nutrition? You can all tell me the carbohydrate, protein content of what you ate for breakfast. You can all tell me that you have a fitness strategy. You can all tell me that you know the difference between good hydration and bad hydration. How many of you have a meaningful strategy around your networks and your knowledge and your time, which is the triptych that underpins having what I call social health? So that's the bad news, is everyone's not really got a strategy. The good news is it's very easy to get one. Social, I'm just going to say, is empirically hardwired into the human. And that's why you're a great audience to talk to about this, because you understand that relationships underpin everything that helps you get done what you do. But what's interesting about the new neuroscience research is it's really showing that our relationship and who we connect to is the essence of what it means to be human. They can try and make the AI computers do that, but I think they're going to take a long while to catch up. Who we are and who we trust and who we believe and who we like is who we work with and do things for and make things happen. That is the human way of spreading. So for me, social networks mixed with social capital is social health, 21st century social health. The triptych I talk about with social health is managing your networks, managing your time, managing your knowledge. And just to be clear, I say this advisedly to a room full of educators and people working in education. We're sort of boogling out on education and overload. There's too much. We need to navigate and curate our knowledge. This is an interesting paper, also published in 2001, about the way in which knowledge resides. And the punchline is that these researchers found that knowledge doesn't reside vertically. It sort of resides in a wiggle. So in other words, it could be that the Vice-Chancellor is the king pin and knows everything, and it could be that his PA is, okay? Information and knowledge is stored in interesting, diverse places. And interestingly, what these researchers found is that there were 4 key factors to the way knowledge is both insulated and spread. And one of them, which I'm going to come on to a little bit, is time. Making the time to accrue knowledge and to spread knowledge. But just to underscore the point about overload, this was a wonderful novel I read over the summer, A.M. Holmes' May We Be Forgiven, and it's just in the middle of a chapter about something completely different. A kid is shown around the library. You know, we have approximately 1.5 million volumes and an active interlibrary loan system. Hello, that's a little bit too much to get your head round. And part of the problem is the way modern knowledge is stored and exchanged in the digital age is electronically. It has its uses, the search function, all of that's great. But the most powerful, most retained exchange of information is done person to person. We've all become massively over-reliant, in my view, on the technical digital solution to the way we store and spread knowledge. And I'm talking about the sort of business-to-business spread of knowledge. I'm actually not talking about the teaching of knowledge. That's a whole other subject. But I'm talking about those of us who have huge amounts of information to retrieve and share. We need to not rely only on the technology people. We need to rely on our ability as human transmitters. Or you might as well store 1.5 million zillion bits of information and forget about it. How do you get it out from one person to another? How do you spread it along the human network? So here are some numbers. Part of the problem is that we have been sold infatuation with everything that's mass, that's technologically assisted, and that's at scale and at speed. But here are some numbers. So 69, it's not a rude position of great intimacy. It is the years since the World Health Organization first defined health. All right? So it's not a lot of human years in which to have, I don't know why it's not clicking, but anyway, you can all read the number 69. 168, really interesting number. 168 is the number end to end of hours in the week. Okay? So it's not 168,000, which is what you're sort of led to believe as you're perma-connected and you're on your mobiles. It's 168, and sorry to give you the bad news, a third of that time you're sleeping or useless. You know, you're not producing, you're not working. And a third of the time, you know, you're having a wee, or you're phoning the dentist, or you're da-da. So really, 56 hours, okay, if you're really maxing out, I'll give you 80 hours. 80 hours a week in which to do everything. To deal with the tsunami of emails, to exchange information informally at the water cooler, fantastically important, by the way, and so on and so forth. So we have a disconnect in this connected age of expectation. We are being sold the fantasy that we can all be enabled through app number 780 to make our lives easier. Yes, but we cannot stretch the time. And in fact, we don't just stretch the time, we waste the time, at least I do. This is the number of tweets per second, and that's probably just me, okay? That's a big number. It's probably out of date. This is another interesting number. This is the number of Americans who go to a gym. It's about 16%. Now, that number is interesting to me because it's a very short period of time in this society that we began to take our health seriously with mass fitness. The ancient Greeks did this with the wonderful holistic arete system that the ancient philosophers write about. But actually with social health, we need to join the equivalent of gyms for the way we manage our knowledge and our networks. We need to create new ways of connecting in this age of overload. So those 50 million people are onto something. One of the ways in which I suggest you do this is by constructing health-type models for the way you manage information overload. The 5 a day, I imagine that's a global metric. It's certainly American and British. 5 a day is a completely made-up concept around fruit, vegetables and fruit. But it works because you kind of remember it. Because between 5 and 7 is sort of the number of things you can hold in your head. So have 5 kinds of knowledge a day that you begin to own. You begin to focus from this mass scale into the now. Read something long, read something short. A blog and a tweet is not the same as a New Yorker article. Watch something on the television, on YouTube. The way you watch TV is a difference to the way you listen to a podcast or listen to the radio. You need, in my view, a mixed diet of information. So it's not just enough to be poring over one document in a narrow, siloed, undiverse network way. You need to be broadening your thinking all the time, a little bit every day. Here's another number. This is a very well-known number, and interestingly, it's not a million miles away from the 168 hours in the week. It's the Dunbar number, the anthropologically maximum number proven to be what human beings can hold in terms of relationships. Robin Dunbar, the professor of evolutionary psychology at Oxford, has done a lot of research on primates and has proved, and of course the way military organizes, and there's a number of examples. So when you come to manage your networks and you begin to look at who you know on LinkedIn and who you know on your group email and who you know on Facebook and who you know on Twitter and who you know in your little black book, it's going to feel overwhelming. All of us look after databases that are huge. You need to make it manageable and keep it real and keep it human. And so what I suggest you do is move, in a period of time into fractional proportions that you can manage and own, just like you do your health. Nobody loses 5 stone overnight. Nobody runs a marathon overnight. You prepare for it, you plan for it, you organize it. That's what I think people need to do around their networks. Take 150 from your different sources and own the relationship with them and figure out what you're going to do with them. This is my very first business card, hundreds of years ago when there were still cars and horses, at the BBC. And I just want a little shout out for the business card. Whilst I hate all of the associations people used to make around networking, that it was, the best way to work a room and it was transactional and the business card is the emblem of that, I'd like to give a different perspective, which is the way in the Far East business cards are handed over with both hands as an act of great connection. The point is, don't throw your business cards around. When you are hanging out in this wonderful case conference over 3 days, do not work the room. Do not think that you have to speed date to get the maximum da-da-da. Have one conversation once with a person. If you leave a room having had a great connection, brilliant. And if you give your business card, make it because you want to make it mean something. Don't ask or give a business card just because you can, because you've got to manage it. If you don't manage it, that's like saying, oh, well, I'll have another cake and I'll just worry about what happens afterwards. That's not what we do with our physical health. So let's not do it with our social health. But don't ditch the business card. Just briefly, I would put it very simply that there is a hierarchy of communication, and when we talk about managing our networks, managing our connection, we need to understand the bottom of the pyramid is the least intimate. It's the broadcast form. You know, yes, you can go on social media. Yes, you can mass mail. Yes, you can do the Vice Chancellor's newsletter. Blah, blah, blah. It doesn't do the same job as what we're doing now. I wouldn't even do this by webcast. You are reading me, I'm reading you. I'm trying not to freak out the bloke right in the middle of my sightline who's asleep. You're looking at my shoes, right? It's a different level of intimacy. Diplomats even say that they can smell people as you walk into a room, which is a bit oversharey for me, but I know what they mean. So when you send an email, that's great, but you know what you want to do? You want to look at that email list and you want to say, who haven't I spoken to ever on this list? Who haven't I spoken to in a long while? And upgrade them to people that you connect with face to face, because that's the best intimacy, that's the best exchange of knowledge, that's the best trust. Just a little bit about the diary and time. I'm not even going to ask if any of you feel you have time to spare, because I really know the answer. The diary is like the body, and yet 80% of the people in this room are likely to feel they do not have full ownership and control and strategy around their diary. That's got to change if you buy into my social health idea. How you manage your time, your precious time, your 60 to 80 hours a week, come on, is critical, totally critical. And you are throwing it away by letting someone else manage it, and you're throwing it away by not having an organized methodology around what you do with your time. That is all I have to say on that. I'm going to end with a quote by one of the founders of the global education movement, who's not to everybody's taste, although he was an Assistant General Secretary of the UN for 40 years. But I'm very struck by what he wrote in 1992 for a book on networks. This is my belief, that networks are hugely democratizing, equalizing, validating, important. They are forces for change and forces for good, but you have to take them seriously, otherwise they will become purely transactional. And the human transmitter is following patterns set down to the history of time, and the technology that we use is following the patterns that they use and we use. But let me put it another way. How many psychoanalysts does it take to change a light bulb? One. But the light bulb has to really want to change. So on that note, I hope that I've given you a taste of the exciting, very significant body of work that exists right across from sociology and history and behavioral science, and behavioral economics and social network science into the world, not just of the networks, but the world of the networker. Thank you. So I think I'm directing my own questions or comments. Please feel free to say if any of what I've said you think is nonsense or baloney. In the interest of diverse networks, please don't all agree with me. Does anyone have a comment or a question? I can't see any hands and I can't see any microphones. So that might mean I need to pick on someone at some point. Hang on, there's people sort of slightly... Okay, there's one.
Julia, you mentioned... Can you wait for the microphone?
Wait for the microphone, and then I'm going to repeat the question, I think, so everybody can hear it.
Hi, Julia. You mentioned about how 150 is the magic number. So should I take that to mean I should start culling my Facebook friends down? I don't know if that's what you meant by that, and if so, yeah, should I do that?
First of all, tell me, give me your name, rank, and serial number.
My name is Simon. I'm a marketing manager at the University of Birmingham.
Okay. Everyone heard the question. Simon asked, what does the 150 Dunbar number mean in practice? Does it mean you have to cull your connections? It's a really, really good question. The answer is yes and no. The no is, no, you don't ever ditch people. But the yes is that you bring into focus in the hierarchy of communications who you are going to strengthen and build relationships with and how you're going to do that. Because if you don't, that is a little bit like saying, I'm going to do 15 push-ups and then I'm going to eat 17 donuts, or I'm not going to go to the gym for 3 weeks and then I'm going to go to the gym for an hour and a half. The evidence contradicts that. So it's really about figuring out your time and your networks and learning how to focus. And I think that 150 over a 3-month period is about the maximum that you might phone up, say, I haven't heard from you for a while, I thought I would send you this. Or you might have 150 colleagues that you organize around if you're doing change program. You might say, who are the 150 people in the case community around the world that I most want to connect to and why? So it's really about thinking how you're going to do things rather than assuming, as we've done, that technology will help us, you know, the electronic diary and the app, or that somehow it'll happen osmotically. That's what we've been led to believe, and I'm saying won't work like that. Anybody else? Anyone at the back? There's a question.
Hi, Julia. I'm Caroline from the Philanthropy Company. It was really just to add to that point, really, which is that I've noticed with very elderly people, or at times of crisis, that is a time when people kind of ditch their networks and narrow down to just a core group. So I'm thinking of my mother, who is in the last stages of her life, and she now says, oh, it's not worth seeing them, and narrows it down to probably about 12 people. And I think that's quite interesting, how actually your network expands and then narrows. And I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, I think the physics and spatial dimension in which people go out and network and come in a network is important. So, you know, my mother is 83 and has a very good face-to-face network built around concerts and dining, if you like. But I mean, she wouldn't understand social networks. She can access things electronically and do email. So everybody has to work with the mediums that they're familiar with. The 12 is an interesting number. You know, the 150 is actually for a kind of organizing around mass communication, even though it appears to be tiny compared to, say, how many people you're on Twitter. But in any given, you know, none of us even have 12 people on speed dial. None of us look at the same 12 websites. We look at the same 3 websites. So in fact, the numbers get very, very, very small. But the question of isolation, whether that's digital isolation or face-to-face isolation or intellectual isolation, you know, I mean, I do think, I don't want to offend anybody, but, you know, religious beliefs that are exclusive to the point where everything else is tuned out are not healthy, for instance. Any more for any more? I'm reading all these twitches. Yes.
Hi, I'm David from the University of Nottingham. I was very interested in the jazz ensemble against the orchestra and the reactivity against the rigidity. And I was just wondering how, in a small and a large team, how that actually works on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I'm very interested in the phrase and the meaning of the idea, what does success look like? You know, what are any of us trying to achieve at any given time? And I think that we live in a very dynamic world, and so what I want to achieve personally and professionally over the next 3 months is in fact not what I want to achieve over the next 6 months. So one of the things is that everything needs to be much more short-term, even if the horizon is still long-term. We need to work with much more of the now. And you want to ask, what are the processes involved and the people in those processes that are going to get that definition of success? Now, in the case of some organizations, you need to have a review to figure out what success looks like, but many of us know what we're trying to achieve. And then it's about mapping, possibly even using social network analysis to map how robust and resilient the organization or the department is. Who are the connectors? Who are the super spreaders? Who are what I would call the librarians? Who are the people that are going to be bringing in and synthesizing and sharing knowledge, as well as the people that are going to go out and make the face? And so it's those sorts of strategies that need to be deployed in order to make a decision about, okay, and what are we doing between now and then? And just perhaps to finish, a very inspiring case study to me is the one of Muhammad Yunus and the microfinance. 80% of women in Bangladesh now have access to microfinance, which was regarded as impossible. But Muhammad Yunus worked backwards from what does success look like? What would happen if these women in Bangladesh did in fact have access to finance and therefore could feed their families? And it's a very good story of how it worked. And he then went one step further and he said, okay, that's fine, but these women are still not as fulfilled and happy as they could be because a lot of their children are suffering from vitamin A deficiency and have night blindness. What does success look like to alleviate that? And again, using networks, using strategies, he was able to create something that people said was impossible, and he began to sell seeds. And then the women made money from the seeds, which grew vegetables, and the night blindness was cut. So, like I say, network behavior rather than network theory is what matters. And I think everyone, I know that I try this in my life as a person and as a professional, it's important to take a step back and to do your own map of your own network. You know, is it out of control like a scale-free network? Is it all just like proliferating crazily so that you can't think? Is it that you have a very limited pathway that's blocking? Or, you know, what does your own network map look like? And networks, I think, are at the heart of social health.